People, what was the best instant karma moment you have witnessed? My boss, who kept calling me preacher and making my job harder, joked about getting hit by lightning and then got struck by lightning while driving his van. This is one of those stories I hesitate to share because I'm not sure I'd believe it if I heard it from someone else. A few years ago, when I went back to college, I attended a school known for its seminary program. Since the school had that reputation, my boss started calling me preacher, which I didn't mind. But he was a bit of a jerk. He liked to intimidate people, and if you didn't back down, which I didn't, he would find ways to make your life harder than it needed to be. Whenever I'd call him out on it, he'd joke, "I wouldn't pick on a preacher like you. I might get struck by lightning or something." This happened so often that I just stopped thinking about it, until one night. He pushed me a little too far, and I got in his face more than I probably should have. He wrote me up for it. Normally, I'd stay a little late to help him shut things down, but that night I just left as soon as my shift was over and let him deal with things on his own. That night, there were thunderstorms and tornadoes. It was the night a massive twister tore a mile-wide path through Oklahoma City. Those of you old enough to remember might recall it. It was a wild night, even though the worst of it didn't come within 15 miles of me. I vividly remember water blowing in around the seals of my patio door. Anyway, I'd cooled off by the next day at work. Normally, I'd check in with my boss first thing, but when I tried, he wouldn't talk to me. He just muttered something and stomped off, acting upset. Have you ever been in a group where everyone seems to be in on a joke, but you can't figure out what's so funny? That's the vibe I got that day. Finally, I got the chance to ask what was going on, and that's when I found out my boss's van had been struck by lightning on his way home the night before. At first, I thought it was one of the many pranks we used to pull on each other, but it turned out to be true. The lightning hit the chrome luggage rack on top, burned a hole in the roof, flattened both back tires, and completely fried the electrical system. He ended up trading the van a few days after it was repaired. By then, he'd had a few fuses blow for no reason, and I had to fix a wire going to the starter solenoid so he could get home that night. I'm not claiming divine intervention, but he sure didn't want to take any chances. He only got loud with me once more in the next month or so. When he did, our QC guy chimed in saying, "You'd better leave him alone. That last one was just a warning shot." The boss shot him a dirty look, then stomped off. Before we continue, do us a quick favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. The other day I was taking my dog for a walk around the neighborhood. She squatted down to take a dump, and I reached for my doggy bags only to realize I was fresh out. So I peeked around making sure nobody was looking, and I just left it. 10 minutes later, I'm walking across the road, and I cut through a thin grass median in the center, and what do you know? I step in dog crap. I wasn't even mad. I knew I deserved it. Story 3. A few years ago, some friends and I went to Hookahville, a 3-day-long hippie festival in Ohio. On the first night, we were all having a great time tripping out. Around 2 a.m., as my mushroom trip was starting to wind down, a guy stumbled over to our tent area. This guy was clearly in no condition to function. He said he had taken both tabs and shrooms, and decided to piss next to our tent. We immediately started yelling at him, telling him he was peeing on our Cheetos. He briefly snapped out of it, realized what he was doing, shrugged it off, and wandered off without apologizing. About an hour later, he came back, sat down, and got super quiet, clearly tripping hard. Out of nowhere, he says, "I frigging love Cheetos," grabs the piss-soaked bag, and starts munching on the soggy Cheetos. My friends and I just exchanged looks, shrugged, and let him keep going. The last thing he said before disappearing into Tent City was, "Hey guys, these Cheetos are all soggy and crappy." TLDR, ate shrooms at a festival, guy pissed in our Cheetos, and then ended up eating it. Story 4. Late one night, I was on the train heading home when I was woken up by a group of loud, drunk guys shouting racist slurs at anyone who even vaguely looked non-white. One passenger, fed up with their nonsense, told them to shut up or get off the train, and the drunks flipped out, screaming at him. Then a guy, who happened to be black, stood up and told them to calm down. The drunks immediately started yelling at him, saying they were going to beat him up. As this was going down, a few other passengers started to get up and move toward the troublemakers. At this point, the black guy gets up, and it turns out he'd been slouching in his seat because he was absolutely massive. He had to turn sideways just to move past the little handrail in the middle of the train because his shoulders were so broad. He then put on a hat that had transport security written across it in bold letters. He hit the intercom button and told the train guard to arrange for the police at the next stop, then walked over to one of the drunks, grabbed him, and calmly told him that he just wanted to get home after a long shift, so everyone better behave, because his patience was running thin. The whole train started cheering for the security guy and yelling at the idiots. The drunks were escorted off at the next station, and it was truly a beautiful moment of justice. Story 5. A few years ago, my then-boyfriend and I were at our local dive bar, enjoying some beers on a typical afternoon. Everything was going fine until this petite woman with a killer body walked in, clearly flaunting herself to every guy in the place, including my boyfriend. I was a decade older than her, so I just brushed it off. As long as she didn't get too close and try anything with him, let her have her fun. Those are the moments when you feel confident, and they don't come often. But soon, the entire bar was distracted. The bartender was so busy flirting with her that he forgot to keep our beers coming, and my opponent at the pool table was so out of it that the game was turning into a total walk in the park for me. Now I was getting annoyed. I could have said something, but I knew it would just sound like jealousy, so I kept quiet and tried to salvage what was left of my happy hour. Cue karma. She strutted back to the bar in her tall wedges and mini skirt, climbed onto a stool, kneeled, and leaned forward toward the bartender, completely without inners. Sexy. Only if you're into seeing a bloody tampon string hanging out. That next beer? It was especially satisfying. Story 6. I'm from Minnesota, but lived in Illinois for a while. One day, during a snowstorm, I was in the left lane, going about 30 in a 55, because the roads were that bad. There was someone next to me in the right lane, doing about the same speed. Behind us, a woman in a small SUV, like a CRV, was bouncing between lanes, honking her horn. When we hit a red light, the guy next to me turned right, and the woman moved up next to me. She rolled down her window and started yelling at me. I rolled mine down to hear her better, and she yelled, "If you don't know how to drive in the snow, get the hell off the road. Some of us have places to be." Or something like that. I don't remember exactly. The light turned green, and she sped off like a bat out of hell. She quickly got up to speed, but as she approached the next red light, she slammed on her brakes and slid on the snow, crashing into the car in front of her. I stopped, went up to her window, and asked if she was okay. She nodded, dazed, and I said, "If you don't know how to drive in the snow, get the hell off the road." Moral of the story: four-wheel drive only helps you move forward, not stop or turn. Story 7. Last year, I was feeling unhappy with my job and decided to speak to my manager about possibly switching to a different position or taking a course to learn something new. I thought it would be a win-win situation. Instead, I was told that if I didn't like my job, I should quit and find something else. After all the hard work I had put into that company, it really crushed my spirit. Fast forward to last month, and a coworker took over my manager's position while she got downgraded to an assistant role. Sweet, sweet karma. Story 8. I live in a college town, and my roommates and I had planned to throw a big party for my birthday. We had just finished setting up, blasting music, and cracking open drinks when around 11 p.m., we heard knocks at the door and saw flashlights through the blinds. I knew it was the cops, but I thought it was too early for them to shut us down. I opened the door to find 2 officers and my neighbor standing there. As soon as I did, everyone inside started to leave, and one of the cops handed me a ticket. My neighbor then stepped up and told me we couldn't be doing things like this because he had kids. I was already annoyed, knowing I had to go to court, but there was nothing I could do. The party was over. Fast forward a couple of months, my roommate approaches me, looking worried, and says, "You need to come outside right now." I ask what's going on, but he doesn't answer. I go outside, and there are cops everywhere. They're in the alley, hiding behind sheds and dumpsters, carrying assault rifles. I walk to the front of the house, and it looks like a war zone, cop cars all over the street, plus a big black vehicle that looks like a tank. The street is blocked off, and I'm pretty freaked out because I have no idea what's happening. Then, guys in full camo gear rush into my neighbor's house and drag him out. Apparently, they had a search warrant because he'd been dealing drugs right out of his house, where he had his kids. That was karma. Story 9. Last spring, I didn't have a date to the junior prom. I wasn't exactly thrilled about it, but I figured I'd just go solo. I found the perfect dress, and was actually pretty excited about the night. Then my group of friends told me I couldn't come with them. Why? because I didn't have a date, and it would ruin the pictures if I stood alone. They also pointed out that it would be awkward for me to get ready with them at Claudia's, the ringleader's, house beforehand. And of course, it would be uncomfortable for me to be the only one in the limo without a boyfriend. Plus, they questioned what I'd even do after prom. Everyone knows what goes down at those after parties, right? So, I ended up not going at all. Guess whose limo never showed up? Story 10. Last Saturday, I was on a crowded NYC subway at 2 a.m. Two drunk dudes, young 20s, lighting a joint and walking around flaunting it. One literally came up to me. "You think a pothead ain't gonna smoke a joint?" Whatever that means. The whole train kept ignoring them, and they kept parading around being a bunch of morons. They spotted two taller, athletic-looking dudes and started making fun of them for looking like cops. It was the line, "Which one of you is the sergeant?" that finally put the athletic guys over the edge. They looked at each other, smiled, reached into their pocket, and pulled out their badges. "Okay, boys, empty your pockets." The subway blew up in laughter. They would have gotten away with everything if they just didn't go bother the two plainclothes police officers. Score one for the good guys. And then I went home and smoked a joint in my living room. Story 11. My friend and I were standing in one of two long lines to buy bingo cards at the casino. There was a group a few spots ahead of us, and honestly, they were being obnoxious, talking over each other and getting louder, laughing way too hard at each other's jokes, and complaining about how slow the cashier was. A couple of minutes after we joined the line, 3 more of their friends showed up and cut in front of about a dozen people. The group said nothing, the rest of the line said nothing, and the cutters just stood there chatting like they were entitled. It was infuriating. I wanted to say something, but I didn't want to start a confrontation with a big group of rude people, so I just pointed them out to my friend. She smiled and shrugged, and I thought that was the end of it. Then, the cash-only guy came out from behind the counter and started selling cards to the people still waiting in line. My friend and I bought our cards and were walking into the bingo hall when we heard, "What the hell? Are you serious? This is ridiculous." It turns out, they closed the line we were in just before the cutters, and their friends were about to get their cards. They ended up at the back of the other line. Hell yes. Story 12. I had a rough relationship over the summer. There were constant fights, and whenever she got really upset, she'd slap me. One night, I could sense a fight brewing, so during the calm before the storm, I told her that she needed to stop slapping me when she was upset. The fight started anyway, slaps were exchanged, and I tried to calm things down, asking her to be quieter so we wouldn't wake my neighbors. I was trying to end the relationship, but she was freaking out so badly that she tore my favorite shirt in half. Then there was a knock at the door. Cops showed up. They separated us, and when they asked her if things had gotten physical, she admitted to slapping me. She was in cuffs almost immediately. Story 13. My son's mom left when he was just 2 months old. She chose the club scene and random hookups over being a mom. Now my son is 10, and we don't have any contact with her. From what I see on her Facebook, her life has fallen apart. She has 4 kids with different dads and has been in and out of jail. Child Protective Services are keeping an eye on her, and she has nothing to do with my son. But here's the kicker. She posted on Facebook blaming her messed up life on me, claiming I put witchcraft on her because I'm her firstborn child's father. Haha, nope. That's just karma doing its thing, and it's a bish. Meanwhile, my son and I have had a wonderful life. Story 14. I worked as a nurse at a mental health facility for the elderly for over a year with a perfect work record, and I also worked at another facility for the same company for the same amount of time with no issues. However, my coworker found out I had PTSD and decided to share this information with my boss at the psychiatric facility. Together, they plotted to have me committed. In October 2012, they set their plan in motion. I was working a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. shift and doing fine for the first 2 hours when my boss called me into her office to congratulate me on my 1-year anniversary. Once we were alone, she started grilling me about my mental health, questioning how it affected me at home. Before I knew it, she was forcing me to call my coworker, who was off duty, and making me go with her to the psych emergency department because I had PTSD. The entire meeting was designed to stress me out, to trigger a reaction that they could use as an excuse to have me carted off to the hospital. Their goal was for the emergency room staff to see me as unstable and to lock me away in a padded room. But the hospital didn't agree. They said I was just stressed out from being forced to go to the hospital for no reason, other than admitting I had PTSD. After I was released from the hospital, my boss placed me on extended medical leave without telling me, ignoring my calls for 2 weeks. She also wrote false reports about me to her superiors and HR. I filed a union grievance and also submitted a complaint to a third-party whistleblower company to ensure the company's head office would be aware of what happened. My boss lied about me to everyone, claiming I told her I had a murderer in my head and that I was standing in front of mirrors with knives wanting to harm myself. They believed her, so my complaints were shut down. I took the case to the Human Rights Tribunal, representing myself against the largest long-term care provider in North America, and I won. The entire process took 3 long years from the incident to the trial's conclusion, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. By the time the trial happened, my boss's health had declined significantly. She lost her job, had to move to the mainland, and now there is a permanent public record of what she did. The co-worker who helped her is also on the permanent record. The employees at the job site were ordered to learn about what happened to me and the outcome. She will never be comfortable working at that site again, and her actions are known to all. I was awarded the highest amount for damages to my dignity and self-worth. I also set a precedent for others with PTSD who have a clean work history and do a good job but struggle with symptoms at home. There's no karma sweeter than $40,000 and a clear reputation. Story 15. One night, after dinner with my wife, we were heading home and got off the freeway at our exit. At the bottom of the ramp, there's a 2-lane stoplight where you can go left or right, and just to the left is the freeway entrance. So, if you U-turn from the left lane, you're right back on the freeway. This guy behind us had been tailgating for miles, and I was already annoyed when he followed us all the way down the exit ramp and nearly rear-ended us as we stopped at the light. Apparently, he thought the light was taking too long, so he pulled into the right-hand turn lane and decided to make a U-turn right in front of us, heading back towards the freeway entrance while the light was still red. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Just as he completed his U-turn, the car that had been behind him pulled around us, and suddenly, red and blue lights lit up the intersection. The officer then blasted his speaker. "That was really stupid. Pull over now." As the guy was pulling over to the shoulder, we casually turned left on the green light and continued on our way home, feeling pretty satisfied. Story 16. I was in daycare as a child. I had very long hair that my dad always put into a ponytail. There was a girl that would pull my ponytail all the time. We were doing a musical chairs thing at the end of the day, while parents were picking us up. The girl was behind me and kept yanking my ponytail. I kept telling her to stop. The teacher didn't see anything, so I can't do anything about it. There were a bunch of parents waiting for us to finish our game, my mom included, and she kept doing it and the teacher didn't see it, so I turned around and punched her as hard as I could. She stumbled into the cubbies, where we kept our coats. The teacher tried to chastise me, and my mom was like, "Nope. I didn't see anything." Didn't even get in trouble. Story 17. This isn't my story, it's my dad's. Back when my dad was in college, his dorm had about 15 floors. There was a guy, let's call him Chester, who lived in the center apartment on the 14th floor, facing north. This meant Chester's window was directly above the main entrance to the dorm. Chester, being the troublemaker he was, liked to unwind by throwing water balloons at people walking into the building. He didn't do it to anyone he particularly disliked. He just thought it was fun to mess with everyone. One day, he hit my dad. Big mistake. So, my dad and his friend decided to get back at him. They hauled a garbage can up 15 flights of stairs, filled it with water from the bathroom, and then made their way to his friend's dorm, which just so happened to be the center dorm on the 15th floor, right above Chester's. As they were waiting, a couple of girls walked up the steps toward the door. Chester, ready with his water balloons, leaned out of his window to get the drop on them. Instead, he got a full garbage can of water dumped right on him. Story 18. I was sitting at a stoplight when I saw 2 preppy girls from the university chasing pigeons off the sidewalk. Every time they moved, the pigeons flew a few feet further. As they reached the intersection, one of the girls squealed and ran right at them. The pigeons took flight in the same direction, heading across the street, just as a bus sped by at around 35 to 40 miles per hour. 2 of the pigeons didn't make it in time and were instantly turned into a cloud of feathers and bits of pigeon. That's when I heard a blood-curdling scream. "They're on me! They're on me!" One of the girls was absolutely covered in pigeon guts and feathers, totally freaking out. Meanwhile, her friend was doubled over in laughter. I don't think she'll be tormenting pigeons anytime soon after that. Story 19. I'm from San Diego, and during the summer, if you want a bonfire pit on the beach for the night, you have to claim it super early in the morning. So, my friends and I got there at 8 a.m. and stayed all day to make sure we had it. Just before sundown, a couple came up and asked if they could share the fire with us. Since our group wasn't too big, we said sure. But then they showed up with like 15 more people, completely surrounded the pit, and basically pushed us out. We were pissed, but after spending the whole day at the beach, we were exhausted and decided to just leave. What we didn't know was that there was an extreme high tide warning that night. As we moved our stuff over the wall separating the beach walk from the sand, a massive wave rolled in and completely wiped out their entire group. It flipped over their table of food, sent a bunch of their sandals drifting into the ocean, and trashed all their belongings. The best part, one girl tried to jump the wall to escape, but didn't make it and fell right back into the water. Karma's a bitch. Story 20. When I was pregnant with our son, this woman tried to steal my now husband. She would say things like, "I'm going to be a better mother to your kid than you could ever be, and your son won't even know who you are," all out of jealousy because he didn't want to be with her. Fast forward 7 years. We're married, have 2 kids, and are living our happily ever after. Meanwhile, she's married, has gained over 60 pounds, and because of her weight gain, she's unable to get pregnant. At first, I thought, karma is a bitch, but after hearing about her 4 miscarriages and the ongoing struggle to have a baby, I actually feel kind of bad for her. Story 21. Back when I was in the military, I was running laps on a grass field when I was about to lap a guy who usually left me in the dust. As I passed him, I couldn't resist yelling, "Gotcha." And literally the second I did, I stepped straight into a hole, twisted my ankle, and went down. Despite the pain of jacking my ankle up, I thought the karmic payout was hilariously timed. Story 22. My old manager was an absolute nightmare, constantly belittling people, creating a toxic work environment, and denying anything that would make co-workers' lives easier while making sure he had every comfort imaginable. The worst part, he refused to give me a half day to attend my mother's funeral and had the audacity to ask, "Would it be a big deal if you couldn't go?" Eventually, his arrogance caught up with him. He wrote up a completely bogus counseling statement about someone, and the entire office finally had enough. While he didn't get fired like we all hoped, he was relieved of his position. Then came the new manager, an Air Force veteran with 20 years of experience, retired at E9. He was well-respected, humble, and actually knew how to handle people. Our first team meeting was a bit awkward, with the old manager bitterly sitting in attendance. As the new manager introduced himself, he noticed the former boss glaring around the table, trying to intimidate people like usual. He stopped mid-sentence, paused for a moment, then said, "When I was in the Air Force, I learned that if you take care of your people, they'll take care of you." Then, locking eyes with the old manager, he added, "And if you don't take care of your people, they'll take care of you." The room was dead silent. Absolute mic drop. Story 23. Late at night, I was stuck on a packed highway barely crawling along because of a bad accident. Traffic was at a standstill. Then, one guy decided he was smarter than everyone else and tried to bypass the gridlock by driving on the shoulder. He actually made it a decent way, until he hit an on-ramp that was just as jammed with cars. With nowhere to go, he was trapped between the rightmost lane and the merging traffic, completely stuck. No one let him in. I watched as he went from zooming past me, almost disappearing from view to me casually passing him, and eventually losing sight of him in my rearview mirror. Story 24. My father told me a story once from when he was younger. He was in traffic on a 2-lane two-way road. It was backed up in one direction heading into an event of sorts, but there was sparse traffic going the other way. My father starts seeing this tool in his rearview who would pull out from the traffic into the oncoming lane, drive as far as he could before a car started to approach from the other direction, and then get someone to let him back in. After doing this a few times, he gets up to my father when he needs to get back in. My father doesn't budge, and the guy has to throw it in reverse and back up all the way to the end of the line. Of all the fantastic things my father's done in his life and all the lessons he's taught me, if I've taken away one thing, it's that I will never let that guy in. Edit. To clarify, this is not a high-speed situation where people's lives are endangered. Story 25. I work in an ER, and once a girl got brought in by ambulance after being assaulted. She was walking down the street when some guy tackled her to the ground and tried to drag her down an alley. A good Samaritan managed to chase him off and call the cops. Like 20 minutes later, they brought in a guy in full cardiac arrest. Turns out the police found the attacker and chased him several blocks when he collapsed, and his heart gave out. He was dead on arrival, and the victim eyed him right in the ER. Story 26. I was kicking a customer out for being racist and cursing at one of my employees. He was shouting all kinds of offensive stuff on his way out, clearly trying to make a scene. Then, in a grand exit attempt, he tried to slam the door, except it had one of those slow-close mechanisms. He shoved it with all his might, but it barely moved, and in the process, he lost his balance and wiped out right there on the floor. We all had a great laugh. Story 27. When my ex-husband, who stole $4,000 from me to visit his mistress in another country, called me desperately begging for money, actually my credit card number, as if, because his electricity got shut off. Story 28. I was at a party once, and this one girl just kept talking trash about another girl who was on her way. When the other girl finally showed up, a guy picked her up, hugged her, and spun her around, except her foot swung out and kicked the trash-talking girl right in the head/face while she was sitting on the couch. Her beer went flying everywhere, and she ended up with a black eye. Talk about karma. Story 29. This happened to me at work one day. A meth head tried to pay for a $5 scratch-off ticket with 1,000 coins. She claimed she was only 10 cents short. Turned out she was over $1 short, then started complaining, saying any decent person would spot her the money. I basically told her she could try down the street if she wanted. She then pulled out a 20 and bought 2 tickets. As she walked out, she said, "Karma is a bitch." As soon as she reached her car, a cop pulls up behind her and blocks her in. The cops search the car and end up arresting her and her boyfriend. It was absolutely hilarious. Screw her. Edit. Since people are curious about the car search, there's more to the story. I was typing it on my phone at work, so I left out some details. There were 4 meth heads in total, but she was the only one causing a problem. The cops either knew they were there or just happened to be in the area. They recognized the car. It was beat up and stood out. 2 of the guys saw the cops while they were smoking outside, and when I was dealing with her inside, they slipped out the other door. A few minutes later, she went out to the car, where the driver, her boyfriend, was already in. They ran their IDs, found warrants, and searched the car. By the time they searched it, they had already cuffed them and were putting them in the cop car. Story 30. A classmate in school broke one of his legs and was using crutches. He was about to go down the stairs, and another kid kicked one of his crutches down the stairs. I walked down there and got his crutch for him, and while walking back up, the kid who kicked the crutches came tumbling down, and I moved out of the way. The kid broke his arm. Story 31. I worked as a bartender at a bowling alley. For some reason, one of the other bartenders hated me. She was constantly poaching people on my side, horseshoe-shaped bar, so we each got a side. We split tips, and whenever it was her turn to count them down, I know she wasn't splitting them properly, tried to get the scheduling manager to put her on my days, etc. One of my regulars even said she caught her pocketing tips and not putting them in our communal bucket while I was working with her. Well, tournament season started, which everyone dreaded/looked forward to. Dreaded because the shifts were 2 or 3 times as long as normal, and there was a constant rush of people at the bar. I looked forward to because shifts were 2 or 3 times as long as normal, and there was a constant rush of people at the bar, so we'd make as much in a day as we did in a week. Well, the first tournament was teams that she considered hers. They bowled on her side on days she worked, so she knew them well and was looking forward to their tournament tips. She came in, saw that I was scheduled to bartend that day, and flipped out. She started ranting to the manager, who happened to be the scheduling manager, and the owner of the place happened to be standing there. The owner pretty much said I was one of the better bartenders, so I was getting put on the tournaments, and if she didn't like it, she could just leave. My coworker left, and then I got to work her normal shifts as well. Story 32. I was working in a pub in Liverpool and had just arrived, at about 10 a.m., to start my shift. I knocked on the door and waited for someone to let me in. I became aware of some voices shouting and turned around to see 2 guys, shirts off, swaggering towards me talking in a language I didn't understand. They came right up to me, and what little English they did speak came out. They called me a frigging or, and a frigging bish, etc. nasty stuff, and I was really quite scared. I was knocking on the door really hard at this point, but after insulting me and laughing they walked off towards a busy road. I watched them as they walked out into the traffic, waving their arms at the cars to stop for them, then giving the drivers the finger. Suddenly one of the cars stopped, and 4 big guys got out. One of the nasty dudes ran off, but the big man got caught and shoved hard against the car a couple of times, clearly hurting his head and elbow. Then one of the car guys made out that he was going to punch him, big time, drawing his fist far back. The little jerk just covered his face and screamed. They didn't get hit, but the car guys and a lot of passers-by burst out laughing. They let him go, and he ran away. That felt good. Story 33. I work for a contracted unloading service in a warehouse, and one of the guys on my crew is a real pain sometimes. He constantly complains about his work, tries to leave early every day, and bums cigarettes off everyone without ever bringing his own pack. He even owes some of my coworkers money. But I digress. On Thursday, he completely lost it over a produce load and threw a huge temper tantrum, kicking boxes, knocking over tall pallets of product, and causing a lot of damage, right as the site manager walked by his trailer door. He got suspended without pay and was told he's on his last chance with the company. It's only a matter of time before he gets fired. Sweet karma at its finest. Story 34. I was driving on a 6-lane highway when a guy in a Porsche convertible started tailgating me. I wasn't in the far right lane, but I was in the middle, so he could have easily passed me if he wanted to. After a while, he finally zooms around me, honking his horn as he goes by. We both get onto the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and out of nowhere, it starts pouring down rain. There was nowhere for him to pull over, so he had to drive the entire length of the bridge, several miles long, with the top of his car down the whole time. Story 35. This happened back in my younger days. A friend of mine had his cousin visiting around Victoria Day in Canada, which is also known as Firecracker Day. I went over to hang out, and when I got there, I was told he was in the backyard. I went out back and saw him and his cousin lighting off firecrackers. They had a big bowl full of loose firecrackers, and I asked if I could set a few off too. Instead of handing me some, they started throwing lit firecrackers at me while laughing. I figured they were being greedy and immature, so I decided to leave. Just as I was about to head out, a spark landed in the bowl, and in a split second, the whole thing went up in flames, leaving only a few unexploded. The whole thing lasted about 10 to 15 seconds. The look on my friends' and his cousin's faces was priceless, pure karma's a bish moment. I couldn't help but laugh at them, especially since I'm sure they had planned the whole afternoon of firecracker fun. Story 36. I was working at a summer camp this past summer, and all the male campers and staff were playing dodgeball while the girls were off doing their own girl night activities. It was campers and junior staff versus staff, and as the night was winding down, the rules for the staff were that if you got hit, you were out with no chance of coming back in. I looked across the gym and saw one of my fellow staff members had been hit and was lying on the ground with his hands behind his head. So, naturally, I grabbed a dodgeball, snuck up behind him while staying out of his sight, and threw it right at his dong. I was laughing and running away when the ball bounced off his dong, and without missing a beat, he kicked it as hard as he could. It came flying straight at me, and it hit me square in the face with enough force to knock me off my feet. Story 37. My son's abuser walked free in court. None of our mutual friends believed he was capable of doing something like that, and as a result, I was socially shunned after the hearing. Not long after, the man was hit by a car and spent 9 months in a coma before eventually passed away from an MRSA infection in his lungs. I don't want to say I'm glad he suffered, because someone who could do something like that to a child is already on their own karmic path. The relief I feel comes from knowing that my son will never be hurt by that man or his father again. Story 38. I went to a small school with only about 80 students, and in my class, there were just 12 of us. Despite our small numbers, we still had the classic bully. Let's call him Christopher. Christopher was the type who thought he could do whatever he wanted to anyone, always getting off the hook by finishing with, "It's just a joke." He was, without a doubt, a grade A jerk. Then there was Todd, a mentally challenged kid in our class. Todd loved asking questions. It was his way of gathering information. While it may sound harsh, his constant questioning did get on our nerves after a while. We were just kids, after all. Despite that, we always looked out for him and made sure nobody gave him a hard time. He was one of us, and that meant something, even if it was sometimes a little challenging. The incident that led to some serious karma happened when we were the oldest year in the school. We basically ruled the place, and naturally, that power went to some of our heads. None more so than Christopher's. We were practicing for an upcoming rounders, kind of like UK baseball competition. We were split into 2 teams, and I ended up with Todd on my team. As you can imagine, Todd wasn't exactly athletic. Picture Kermit the Frog attempting the 110-meter hurdles. Yeah, that unathletic. We were losing, mostly because the other team had better players. I had already lost interest and was giving lackluster hits when it was my turn. Then it was Todd's turn. I watched just to see how it would go. And of course, Christopher was pitching. He wasn't even trying to give Todd a fair chance. He threw the ball at Todd's feet, laughing with his teammates each time. The pitches were so bad, even Babe Ruth couldn't have done anything with them. It went on like this for about 3 minutes. Eventually, even his own team told him to throw a decent pitch so Todd could strike out and they could move on with the game. Christopher finally threw a decent pitch. Todd, clearly nervous and fighting back tears, stood ready. As the ball came toward him, I felt time slow down. The next thing I knew, whack. Todd didn't just hit the ball. He absolutely obliterated it. The sound was deafening. It was like a bomb had gone off. The ball shot back at Christopher with such force that it was a blur. I don't even know how fast it went, but I do know it hit Christopher square in the eye. He dropped like a sack of potatoes out cold. One of his friends helped him inside while the rest of us, both teams, erupted in laughter and cheers. We lifted Todd up on our shoulders, celebrating his epic moment. No longer just Todd, he became Todd, the destroyer of a-holes. Story 39. This is one of those moments I count as both karma and justice, because honestly, that woman totally deserved it. It happened a few years ago, and I shared the story on a different account that's long gone, but I just had to retell it. I used to live a street or two behind a central suburban bus stop at the top of a big hill. Every day, I'd take the bus to university, which was about an hour away. One morning, I got on the bus, and we pulled up to the intersection, waiting for the light to turn red so we could get the green. We got the green light and started pulling out when, out of nowhere, this snooty middle-aged woman in a red suit, I'll never forget the details because it made me so mad, blazed through the red light in her big silver Cadillac, going the same way the bus was turning. The bus driver had to slam on the brakes, honking at her. But instead of stopping or even acknowledging the mistake, this woman flipped off the bus driver and just kept speeding on. The bus driver, a jovial, large black lady, muttered a few choice words and kept on driving. Now, from the bus terminal to the city, there's a huge hill that slopes down before it flattens out in the valley. And in the mornings and evenings, the cops like to patrol the bottom of the hill, especially since they can catch people speeding with their radar guns coming down the hill. There's a curve in the road, so if you're going too fast, you don't see the cops until it's too late. Well, guess what happened next? We got to the bottom of the hill, and there, right at the intersection, was that same silver Cadillac pulled over by the cops, getting a ticket. The bus driver saw it, grinned, and said, "Oh yeah, baby." She pulled the bus over to the sidewalk near the intersection and flagged one of the cops down. The cop came over and asked what was going on, and the bus driver asked if the lady in the Cadillac had been caught speeding. The cop confirmed she had, and the bus driver shot back. "Oh yeah? Is it still illegal to run a red light?" The cop chuckled and said, "Yep, it is." Then he asked her if the woman in the Cadillac had run the red light, and the bus driver confirmed she had. The cop asked, "Well, we'll add that to her ticket. Would you be willing to come to court as a witness?" And the bus driver, with a huge grin, said, "Honey, I get paid to go to court for stuff like this. It'd be my pleasure." And that's when the entire bus erupted into applause. It was such a perfect moment. Story 40. This isn't my story, but my mom's. When she was younger, there was this girl at school who was always a huge jerk to her, constantly making fun of her for no reason. Fast forward a few years, and my mom's in college, dating a guitarist from Bob Marley's band. One night, she's at a bar with him, grabbing a drink. He goes to the bathroom, and that same girl from back in the day comes up to my mom and says, "OMG, did you see who's here?" Just as she says that, the guy comes back, puts his arm around my mom, and says, "Hey babe, what's happening?" My mom said the look on that girl's face was absolutely priceless. Story 41. My friends and I were walking down the street in high school, before any of us had cars. Some random girl hung out the window of her friend's car and shouted "Walkers" at us on our way home, throwing a McDonald's soda at us she missed. I noticed something fall out of her car as she threw the soda. We walked up to it, and sure enough, it was a Clutch-style wallet. We opened it up, and there was $80 in it. None of us had jobs, so we were suddenly rich. We split it 4 ways, took her wallet to a nearby park, and took turns peeing on it. I've never been more satisfied spending $20 in my life. This was the 90s, so I could eat lunch for a week on $20. Story 42. I have a farm in Africa. Yes, I'm actually African with a big extended family. It's a small farm, passed down through several generations. My cousins who live there are subsistence farmers. They mostly grow corn, maize, and eat what they produce. There's also a pond for fish farming when the weather allows, though it's been pretty wet lately and the pond has silted up. I was visiting recently to help fertilize the fields before planting. By fertilize, I mean the real deal, 3 months' worth of dung accumulated over the winter, not the chemical stuff. Out of nowhere, a big Land Rover pulls up, packed with tourists. I think they were English by their accents. They were lost and looking for a resort far away. We gave them directions, but they weren't happy with the long route we suggested, though it was the correct one. They insisted their Land Rover could go through anything and wanted to cut through the field. They offered to pay us, but we said no. At some point, they decided to go for it anyway and drove straight into the muddy pond, which was hard to spot because of the overgrowth. Land Rovers are great for off-roading, but not when you're stuck in several feet of mud, vines, and weeds. They tried to back up, turn around, and kept getting more stuck. Eventually, they gave up and walked through the mud to us. We were too stunned to laugh at first, but later, we couldn't help ourselves. They came up to us, sheepishly asking if they could hire a car. We charged them well. We also charged the towing company that came to rescue their car. My cousins ended up making a nice bit of money. Now, it's a family joke that we should be growing tourist cars instead of maize and fish. Story 43. When I was in high school, our city had automatic sprinklers in most of the parks and grassy areas. They'd kick on around 3 or 4 a.m., and being a dumb kid, my friends and I figured out that if you kicked them hard enough, the top would break off, and the sprinkler would shoot a huge stream of water into the air full force. We thought it was hilarious, and of course, we were never caught. We kept this up until one day, they started replacing the old sprinklers with new, super durable steel ones. I kicked one, and not only did I break my big toe, but I rolled my ankle so badly that it bruised up for a week and has never been the same since. Not such a great idea in hindsight. Story 44. In 7th grade, we had a dance unit in gym class, and for some reason, the teachers thought it was a great idea for everyone to do Tailgater. Our middle school was like something straight out of Mean Girls. People were holding grudges from the previous year, old elementary school football rivalries were still alive and well, and the nerds hated the jocks. The popular girls were still pissed over rumors that had been circulating, and smaller cliques of girls secretly envied each other. The social outcasts were ready to take down the bullies. It was a powder keg waiting to blow. Then, we were all packed into the gym, 200 kids, with a giant screen playing a Billy Blank's Tailgater DVD in front of us. At first, the workout was calm enough, but it didn't take long for the usual troublemakers to start causing chaos, kneeing people in the back, punching shoulders, and acting like it was an accident. You could feel the tension building, and before long, the anger was palpable. Suddenly, some of the less popular kids realized that they were being forced to hit and kick, just like their tormentors, who were using Tailgater as an excuse to be jerks. Maybe, just maybe, they could dish out some payback without getting in trouble. Without warning, the gym exploded into a free-for-all of fists and flying feet. Girls who'd been picked on for years started pulling hair and swiping at faces with fake nails. Kids who'd been bullied for ages were handing out black eyes like it was nothing. The attack spread quickly. Those at the top of the social ladder and the well-known bullies were caught completely off guard. Some even bolted for the doors. The gym teachers tried to stop it, but there were only 6 of them. Eventually, school security had to step in to break it up. No one got punished, because how do you punish 200 kids? The injuries ranged from bruises to broken teeth. It was essentially a middle school version of a peasant rebellion, and the nobility got their asses handed to them. But the issues didn't end there. Alliances were solidified, and the neutral kids picked sides, leading to a huge Twitter war that, to this day, I don't think has ever really been resolved. It ended up tearing the school apart. Story 45. Back in 1993, I was leaving work at a nightclub in NYC with a friend, heading toward the train station when we suddenly heard an older lady screaming, "Help! Help!" We turned and saw a guy running away from the screams, holding a woman's purse. I'm not sure why, but I instinctively pulled out my work ID badge. Just a plain ID, not a security badge. I was the DJ. The thief must have mistaken me for a cop, because without hesitation, he raised his hands in the air and threw himself on the ground. No struggle at all. I told him to stay down, or I'd pepper spray him, even though I didn't have any pepper spray. A few minutes later, the cops arrived and arrested him. The elderly lady was incredibly grateful, mainly worried about the family photos in her purse. Instant karma for the bad guy. He didn't even make it halfway down the block with the purse. Story 46. This happened just a couple of days ago. A guy in his BMW 3 Series got stuck in a turn-only lane. In his rush, he cut someone off, and the car behind him honked. Instead of moving along, he stopped, parked his car during heavy traffic, and got out, walking towards the car he had just cut off. What he didn't realize was that there was a police SUV just 2 to 3 cars behind him. As soon as he started walking toward the other car, the officer flipped on his lights. Instant justice. And yes, he definitely fit the stereotypical "law doesn't apply to me" jerk. Story 47. A friend of a friend joined our group when we were heading to a college football game. Throughout the night, he aggressively hit on our attractive friend whose husband wasn't around. She clearly felt uncomfortable, so I pulled him aside and told him she was married. His response: "So, a ring doesn't plug a hole." Later, in the parking lot, he decided to show off his athleticism by sprinting across the dimly lit area. The parking lot had those waist-high poles with chains connecting them, pretty much invisible in the dark. He ran straight into one at full speed, and the chain hit him just below the waist. He came to a sudden stop, swung back, and flipped over it, landing directly on his head. It wasn't a small injury. He could barely walk for a week and ended up with a concussion. Story 48. Instant karma is the best. This might get buried, but I still love this story. I used to commute on a 4-lane road, 2 lanes in each direction, to get to work. There was an intersection where I always ended up with a red light, and during rush hour, I'd sometimes have to wait through a few cycles. The left lane didn't get a green arrow, causing a backup. One day, I was waiting at that intersection with my window down, enjoying the nice weather. 2 guys pulled up in the lane next to me. The traffic was heavy that day, so for 3 light cycles, these guys started yelling disgusting comments at me, calling me names, saying they wanted to do all sorts of inappropriate things to me. I ignored them at first, but that didn't stop them, so eventually, I fired back with some choice words. Finally, it was my turn to go through the intersection. As I pulled away, the guys in the next lane floored it to try to stay even with me, screaming more trash. The problem was the car in front of their lane was turning left, so they couldn't move. I took off just as they rear-ended a brand new Jaguar in front of them. And the best part, I couldn't help but yell aloud, "H-A-H-A," like Nelson Muntz from The Simpsons as they realized what happened. They looked absolutely miserable, and it still makes me laugh every time I think about it. Story 49. I was on my way home from work and stopped at a grocery store to grab a bite to eat. I was wearing a worn-out, torn hoodie that I often wear to work. In front of me in line, there were 2 decent-looking girls. They were speaking a little too loudly, trash-talking the cashier. One of them turned, looked me up and down, and nudged her friend. Pointing at me, she said, "Looks like someone can't afford nice things." Without skipping a beat, I looked her straight in the eyes and in the most sincere tone I could muster said, "My dad gave me this sweatshirt the winter before he passed." Her face went pale, and she immediately started crying. I just walked away and switched to a different line. Story 50. On a trip backpacking around Greece, once I had a bad experience in a hotel and decided to take one of their beautifully painted stone eggs from the bowl in the reception as compensation. When we were on the ferry to the next island, I started noticing a horrible smell coming from my bag. It turns out that it was not a stone egg at all, but a painted boiled egg that had broken in my bag. The whole thing had become so rotten it had turned a nice shade of green, and the smell was almost intolerable. I had to borrow a lot of my friends' clothes for the rest of the trip, but at least it taught me a good lesson. Story 51. Don't start shouting at people just because you think you're higher up the ranks. Experience matters. I work in a law firm, and this story involves a clerk, a junior lawyer, and a senior lawyer. The clerk, with 15 years of experience, was tasked by the junior lawyer, who had only 5 years of experience, to go to a property and take inventory of the items to be sold at auction because the tenant hadn't paid rent to our client, the landlord. On the day of the task, the tenant informs the clerk that he wants to make a payment and keep his business running. The clerk's job then was just to inform the landlord of the tenant's intention. The clerk tells the junior lawyer, and instead of simply acknowledging the situation, the junior lawyer starts shouting at the clerk on the phone, telling him to ignore the tenant and just do his job. The clerk, however, doesn't want to wrongfully lock up the business. After some effort, he finally reaches the landlord, who agrees to accept the payment. The clerk then returns to the office, and the junior lawyer, furious, starts yelling at him for taking too long and not following instructions. He spent over an hour shouting at the clerk, saying he didn't know how to do his job. Later, when we come back from lunch, the senior lawyer hears about the situation. The senior lawyer spends the rest of the day lecturing the junior lawyer, explaining that if a tenant wants to pay, you have to accept the payment. If you don't, it could damage your reputation. The clerk, with 15 years of experience, already knew this. The junior lawyer, however, thought he knew better, only because he wanted to lock up the premises and follow his instructions. The tenant could have sued for loss of profit or damage to his business if the payment was refused. That was by far one of the best examples of karma in action I've seen. Story 52. I was walking home from the grocery store when I lived in California. It was a beautiful day. High 70s, a few clouds in the sky, and a small town vibe with fresh air and no pollution. As I strolled along, I noticed a group of attractive girls sitting outside, enjoying some Cold Stone ice cream they had just bought from the shop next door. As I walked past the parking lot, a guy in a big, flashy truck rolled up, clearly hoping to impress the girls. His plan? To show off his driving skills. So he revs his engine, guns it towards the parking lot exit, and intends to burn some rubber, make a sharp turn, and speed off, thinking that would make him look cool. The girls and I all turned to watch, but none of us were impressed. Honestly, he looked ridiculous. Still, he continued with his plan, smoking his tires as he sped off and sharply turned onto the road. And then, of course, his rear right tire exploded, leaving him grinding the rim against the pavement. His attempt to look like a hotshot came to a screeching halt. The girls had a great laugh at his expense, and the guy sat there, fuming, trying to figure out how to blame anyone but himself for his now-disabled truck. But there was no one else to blame. It was all on him. Worse still, it happened right in front of the girls he was trying to impress, and now he was the one feeling embarrassed. Story 53. I can't say for certain that the same vehicles were involved in both incidents, but here's what happened. I was driving on the motorway, heading toward my junction in the left lane, since I was planning to exit. A large white car suddenly darted into the small gap between me and the lorry behind, then swerved onto the hard shoulder, which, for context, is not for driving. It's for emergencies like a flat tire or engine trouble. This car undertook me on the hard shoulder, cut right in front of me, and then veered into the middle lane, cutting someone else off. I braked to avoid hitting the white car and to give myself space in case he suddenly braked. This caused the gap between me and the lorry behind to shrink, but I had more space in front of me. Space that was immediately seized by a second car, a black BMW, which used it to undertake another car in the middle lane. It looked like the white car and the black BMW were racing each other. Fast forward to when I got off at my junction, M6 Junction 12, and continued my drive. About 45 minutes later, when I was almost home, I heard the travel news on the radio. The M6 southbound was backed up from Junction 11A all the way to Junction 13 due to a crash involving a BMW, which had happened about 40 minutes earlier. Junction 11A is just a mile further than Junction 12. It seems like either the two cars racing were directly involved in the accident, or they caused it. Story 54. My ex-girlfriend cheated on me during the last 3 weeks of our relationship and ended up dumping me for the guy she was seeing. She got pregnant either during the affair or shortly after we broke up, since we hadn't been intimate during that last month. I was busy with school and work, and she stayed at her mom's house, rarely leaving, so there was no time or privacy. She reached out to me after finding out she was pregnant, but by then, I had already moved on. She had the baby about 10 to 11 months after the last time we were together, so unless that baby had an unusually long incubation period, it's definitely not mine. Plus, the child looks more like her actual father than either me or my ex. Last I heard, she and her fiancé have been living at her mom's house for the past few years, while I'm about to graduate with a mechanical engineering degree and start my career at a great company. Story 55. I had a coworker who initially seemed like a great friend, but things took a turn when upper management started openly complimenting my hard work and recognizing my potential. He got a bit hurt by it, and the tension grew from there. A couple of years later, he got promoted to manager, which made sense since he was about 3 years older than me. But once he moved into that role, it felt like a target was placed on my back. He became verbally and mentally abusive, and there were even instances of physical one. I tried reaching out to higher management, followed the chain of command, and even went to HR, but nothing changed. The environment became unbearable. Unfortunately, the pay was so good that I didn't have many options unless I wanted to take a massive pay cut. Eventually, layoffs came, and guess who got cut? Yep, me. At first, it seemed like a setback, but it turned out to be a blessing. Since then, I reapplied to medical school and got accepted. On top of that, I received a job offer that pays me double what I was making before. Karma truly works in mysterious ways. Story 56. I was driving along a public road where the speed limit is 35, and I was going the speed limit, just to clear that up before anyone assumes I was driving too slow. Now this whole time, there was a dotted yellow line, meaning the BMW driver behind me could have easily passed when oncoming traffic was clear, which it was multiple times. So here I am, cruising at 35, when I notice a BMW tailgating me, coming up pretty quickly in my rearview mirror. I brace for impact because, well, I know how this ends. My phone was on the GPS mount, plugged into the cigarette lighter to function as a dashcam, so it would have been useful evidence if she had hit me. She doesn't hit me, but she's close enough that I can't even see her headlights. She had her high beams on, at 11 a.m. no less. She's waving her hand at me, trying to signal me to speed up while she's on her phone. This goes on for a few miles until we hit a stretch of road under construction. The workers weren't there, but they were repaving the road. Up ahead, I see a manhole cover that juts out about an inch or two, poorly placed in the middle of my lane. Since the road was under construction, it's above the surface, so you have to swerve to avoid it. At the last second, I swerve my little Civic around the manhole to avoid hitting it. Unfortunately for the woman behind me, she doesn't have enough time to react. She hits it, spins out, and blows her front left tire. Not surprising, considering she had opted for the M Sport package on her BMW with low-profile tires. Moral of the story: don't tailgate. If the car in front of you has to swerve, there's no time for you to react. And of course, tailgating is just a douche move in general. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.